They commanded the stage beneath roaring lights and swirling smoke, holding microphones like they were swords, never realizing that same smoke would one day become the quiet thief of their final breath. Tonight, we go behind the applause, behind the posters, behind the legends themselves, into the stories of 15 rock icons whose voices were slowly dimmed by the very habit they once believed made them fearless. Do not look away. One story near the end will leave you silent. Let's begin. Number 1. George Harrison. On November 29, 2001 in Los Angeles, the world lost not just a musician, but a spiritual compass, a man who gave music a soul. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, had always walked differently from the others, calmer, softer, wiser. But behind that gentle tone was a long, hidden struggle with a habit that began when he was still a teenager in Liverpool. Cigarettes were once a badge for every rising rocker, a symbol of rebellion tucked behind the lip, flicked between chords and guitar solos. During the height of Beatlemania, he smoked without thought, one cigarette lighting the next while the world screamed his name. Even after the Beatles dissolved and he sought peace through meditation, prayer, and gardens full of blooming life, the smoke never quite left his side. In 1997, the truth revealed itself like a shadow under a spotlight, a growth in his throat. Surgery followed, and though he recovered for a time, the battle had already begun. He never dramatized it. He never complained. He returned to music, speaking more deeply about love, light, and the soul beyond the body. His voice grew softer. His eyes reflected oceans. By the late 1990s, the illness had spread. He retreated from the world into a sanctuary of flowers, incense, guitars, and quiet skies. Those who visited him said his final recordings felt like whispered farewells, every chord a prayer, every lyric a release. When his passing was announced, cities across the world fell silent. Candles glowed in windows. People wept without knowing why. George Harrison taught the world that peace is possible, and also how fragile a human life can be when a habit we underestimate takes root. Number 2. Eddie Van Halen. October 6, 2020, Santa Monica, California. The guitar hero of generations took his final breath. Eddie Van Halen was electricity made human. His fingers didn't just play the guitar, they reinvented it. Stadiums shook under his sound, yet behind the roaring crowds there was a quiet war being fought far from the spotlight. He had started smoking young, just like George, another child of music and pressure. The cigarette in Eddie's fingers became as recognizable as the red and white striped guitar he made iconic. On stage it looked cool, effortless even, but inside his body, smoke had begun its slow work. In 2000, the diagnosis came: tongue cancer. Surgery took part of his tongue, and for a time, victory seemed possible. Fans celebrated. Eddie joked. The band played on. But in 2015, the illness returned, and this time it did not retreat. Even as doctors pleaded with him to stop smoking, he would walk into rehearsals smiling, coffee in one hand, cigarette in the other. "It keeps me calm," he would say, even though everyone could see the storm inside him. As the disease advanced, Eddie found himself holding tighter to the one thing that mattered more than fame: his son, Wolfgang. They recorded together quietly, father and son, musician and legacy. No roaring crowds, no flashing lights, just two hearts speaking through sound. In his final months, Eddie talked more about gratitude than pain. He spoke of life like something borrowed, and when the news of his death broke, the world paused. Guitarists raised their picks in tribute. Fans cried in parking lots, replaying solos that once made them believe they could be invincible. Eddie Van Halen changed music forever. And yet, like so many legends, he learned too late that even the loudest life can be softened by something as quiet as smoke. Fans called him a hero because he was one. Eddie Van Halen's legacy wasn't just about guitar strings and amplifiers, it was about brilliance fueled by passion, a fire so bright it lit the music world for decades. But that fire came with a price. A habit that once steadied his nerves slowly became the very thing that dimmed his voice and stole his breath. And yet, even in his final moments, his spirit burned, tender, grateful, and full of music. Eddie left behind a sound no one can recreate, a legacy no one can replace, and a lesson carved into the heart of rock and roll itself. If his story moved you, share your favorite Van Halen song in the comments, because in remembering, we keep his sound alive. Number 3. Joe Cocker. December 21, 2014, Crawford, Colorado. A quiet winter morning when the world lost one of the most soulful and unmistakable voices ever to grace a stage. Joe Cocker didn't just sing songs, he poured himself into them. Every rasp, every growl, every trembling note sounded like a heart breaking in real time. But behind that raw power was a lifetime of long nights, endless roads, and the silent companion that followed him everywhere: cigarette smoke. He had picked up smoking in the pubs of Sheffield long before fame found him. By the time he stepped onto the stage at Woodstock, his voice already carried the burn of that habit. People thought his gravel tone was a gift of nature, something born deep in the soul. But those closest to him knew it was also the echo of smoke-filled studios and backstage corners where cigarettes eased nerves and filled silence. Through the 1970s and 80s, his voice became the sound of longing itself. From "You Are So Beautiful" to "Up Where We Belong," songs that still play at weddings, funerals, and nights when hearts are heavy. Yet behind the applause, his lungs began to fail. In his final years, he left the stage and found peace on a quiet ranch in Colorado, surrounded not by crowds, but by mountains, gardens, and the woman he loved. Neighbors didn't see a rock star. They saw a gentle, humble man who carried kindness in his eyes. When Joe left this world, fellow musicians didn't just mourn his voice, they mourned the soul behind it. Billy Joel said it best: Joe Cocker was one of the greatest rock soul singers to ever live. His life was proof that some voices are too powerful to forget, even when the lungs that carried them finally fall silent. Number 4. Phil Everly. January 3, 2014, Burbank, California. One half of the Everly Brothers, voices that shaped the very foundation of American music, took his final breath. Phil Everly's harmonies helped define a generation. Before Elvis shook the world, before the Beatles crossed the ocean, the Everly Brothers were already making America feel. Their voices were warm, pure, and impossibly close, as if they were singing with one heartbeat. But behind the soft melodies was a quiet habit that stayed with Phil from the very beginning. He started smoking as a teenager, when every cafe, every studio, every stage was wrapped in a cloud of cigarette smoke. Back then, no one questioned it. It was part of the culture, part of the rhythm, part of the look. The years passed, the songs turned into legends, and the sound of the Everly Brothers became woven into the memory of America. But Phil's lungs were paying the price. Even after decades, even after attempts to quit, the damage had already settled deep. In his final years, Phil withdrew into a quiet life, holding close the people he loved, speaking softly, breathing slowly. His wife later revealed the truth, that smoking was the reason his voice dimmed and his breath grew short. And suddenly, a generation understood the cost hidden behind those flawless harmonies. Phil Everly didn't just leave behind music, he left behind a lesson. The songs remain timeless, but the voice that carried them was not, and the world is gentler now because of it. When news of his passing spread, tributes poured in from legends like Paul McCartney and Brian Wilson, voices who credited the Everly Brothers as the very blueprint of modern harmony. Phil Everly's gentle smile and velvet-smooth tone became symbols of a golden era when music felt pure, honest, and close to the heart. His death marked more than the loss of a man. It marked the quiet fading of a harmony that once defined America's soul. Number 5. Frank Zappa. December 4, 1993, Los Angeles. The world lost one of music's most fearless minds. Frank Zappa was only 52 when he passed, a man known for genius so sharp it cut through every rule the industry tried to place around him. He was a rebel, a composer, a provocateur, and behind the wild arrangements and electric presence was a habit that followed him from his teenage years onward. Cigarettes were always at his fingertips. In the studio, on stage, during interviews, the smoke trailed him like a shadow. He once said cigarettes kept him awake when inspiration refused to wait. He created through the night, chasing sounds no one else could hear yet. Album after album, more than 60 in his lifetime, poured out of him with relentless force. But while the world saw brilliance, his body carried the quiet price. In the late 1980s, doctors diagnosed him with cancer. He never blamed the habit directly, but he never stopped either. Even as the disease progressed, he refused to slow down. He recorded until his final months, composing one last orchestral farewell, spoken entirely in music. When he died, artists across the world honored him, not just as a musician, but as a mind that refused to conform. Frank Zappa's legacy is proof that genius burns bright, but every flame leaves ash behind. Number 6. Carl Wilson. February 6, 1998, Los Angeles. The ocean-soft voice of the Beach Boys fell silent. Carl Wilson was just 51 when he passed after a long battle with lung cancer. His voice carried the soul of endless summers, the warmth of sun, sand, and open skies. Songs like God Only Knows and Good Vibrations live forever because his harmonies came from a place of pure sincerity. But behind the calm presence and gentle tone was a habit that quietly followed him for decades. He began smoking young, when the Beach Boys were just boys, touring constantly, recording endlessly, drowning under pressure no one on the outside could understand. Cigarettes weren't rebellion, they were escape. Through the 70s, Carl became the band's foundation, the one who held everything together when chaos tore at the seams. But his lungs paid the price. By the early 90s, he struggled to breathe. Still, he kept singing. On his final tour, he performed sitting down, voice strong, body failing. Fans had no idea how much strength it took simply to finish each song. When treatment ended, he retreated to the ocean, his first love, his last comfort. He listened to waves and spoke softly about gratitude, faith, and music that outlives the body that creates it. When he was gone, beaches across America played his voice like a prayer carried on the tide. He was the quiet heart of the Beach Boys, the warmth in the harmony, and his loss reminded the world that even the softest voices can leave the strongest echoes. Carl Wilson's legacy remains a melody of devotion, sunlight, and that soft reminder that even the warmest voices can be dimmed when the smoke never truly leaves your lungs. And if his story touched your heart, you already know what the Beach Boys meant to the world. Number 7. Steve Marriott. On April 20, 1991, quiet countryside darkness wrapped itself around a small cottage in Essex, England. But inside that cottage was a man whose voice once roared louder than stadium speakers. Steve Marriott, the soulful fire behind Small Faces and Humble Pie, had returned home late that night after a long recording session. Tired but hopeful about music he believed would bring his comeback. He made some tea, put on a record, and sat down the way he had thousands of times before. A cigarette burned between his fingers, and that one familiar comfort would become the spark of tragedy. Steve had been a force of nature since the 1960s. He was small in height, but giant in presence, a volcano packed into a human frame. On stage, he could whisper you into silence or explode into screams that felt like heartbreak crashing against a wall. Songs like 30 Days in the Hole and I Don't Need No Doctor rose from his lungs with a rawness only life could teach. But behind that fire was a habit that followed him everywhere he went. Smoking wasn't just something Steve did, it was something woven into the rhythm of his life, the background to rehearsals, late-night studio sessions, and quiet hotel rooms where applause had faded but adrenaline still echoed. His friends said he could light one cigarette with the end of the last. He laughed about it in interviews, never thinking his comfort could one day turn deadly. Over time, the same smoke that once steadied his nerves began to wear down the instrument that made the world love him. His voice deepened, cracked, strained. Fans thought it was raw emotion. They didn't know it was pain. Still, Steve pushed forward. He talked often of returning to the spotlight, of one more tour, one more moment under the lights. That night in April, he believed he still had time. But exhaustion took him first. The lit cigarette fell, smoldered, and soon the cottage filled with smoke. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the blaze had spread fast. Inside, they found the voice that had once shaken arenas, now silent forever at only 44 years old. Shock flooded the rock world. Musicians called him one of the greatest voices to ever come out of Britain. Fans cried not only for the legend lost, but for the brutal reminder of how fast a habit can take everything away. Steve Marriott's voice still lives in every old record that howls with grief and glory. Untamed, unfiltered, unforgettable. Number 8. Dan McCafferty. On November 8, 2022, the world said goodbye to the gravel-edged roar at the heart of Nazareth. His voice was unmistakable, rough as stone, aching with life. Songs like Love Hurts and Hair of the Dog weren't just performances, they were confessions. But behind that legendary sound were lungs worn down by decades of heavy smoking. Dan formed Nazareth in the late 19th. Fame came fast, loud and blazing. On stage, he was a storm. His hair flew, the microphone shook, the speakers trembled. And behind the amps, behind the applause, always, there was a cigarette burning. He once said, "Cigarettes felt like company in the silence after the show, when thousands of voices faded and only loneliness remained." But time always collects its debt. By the early 2000s, breathing became a battle. In 2013 in Switzerland, Dan collapsed mid-performance as his lungs finally gave out. He knew then that his body could no longer carry the voice his spirit still wanted to unleash. Tired from touring but continued recording, singing with everything he had left, even as every breath cost him more. He never complained. He never cursed fate. He only thanked the fans who had given him a life he once could only dream of. When the news of his passing came, the rock world bowed its head. Musicians across generations said the same thing. There will never be another voice like his. And they were right, because Dan McCafferty didn't just sing music. He carved his voice into the memory of rock itself. Carl Wilson's legacy remains a gentle harmony carried on the wind, a melody of devotion, love, and the quiet reminder that even the most luminous voice can dim when the smoke never stops curling through the lungs. And if his story touched your heart, share your favorite Beach Boys memory in the comments below. Number 9. Rick Wright. On September 15, 2008, the quiet soul at the heart of Pink Floyd slipped away in London after a long battle with lung cancer. He was 65. To millions around the world, Rick Wright was the architect of atmosphere, the man whose keyboards turned songs into dreams, the one who made the dark side of the moon feel like drifting through space, and who helped paint Wish You Were Here with longing and silence. Yet behind the serenity of his music lived a quieter struggle, a lifelong bond with cigarettes, something that began when he was a student at Regent Street Polytechnic, long before fame wrapped itself around his life. In photos from the 1970s, you can see him seated quietly behind his keyboards, smoke curling like a ghost through the studio lights. The world around Pink Floyd was chaotic, full of pressure, conflict, and expectation, and Rick escaped into music and into smoke. Bandmates said he rarely appeared without a cigarette, even between breaths on stage. It wasn't part of his persona, it was part of his survival. As the years passed and Pink Floyd rose, fell, and rose again, his gentle spirit remained overshadowed by the noise of fame. But the smoke followed him everywhere. In the 2000s, as his health faded, he withdrew with dignity and calm, spending his final days sailing along quiet coastlines, letting the ocean speak where words could not. When the news of his passing spread, the world mourned not just a musician, but a soul who shaped the emotional core of one of the greatest bands of all time. Rick Wright's music still shimmers softly, reminding us that even the gentlest hearts carry private storms. Number 10. Roy Orbison. On December 6, 1988, the world lost a voice that sounded like sorrow and starlight intertwined. Roy Orbison passed away at his mother's home in Hendersonville, Tennessee, after suffering a sudden heart attack. He was 52. For fans who had just watched him return to the spotlight with renewed fire, it felt like watching a sunrise vanish before the day even began. Roy's voice was unlike any other, haunting, operatic, trembling with longing. Songs like Only the Lonely and Crying didn't just play, they ached. But behind that breathtaking sound was a man living in the shadows, exhaustion, personal tragedy, endless nights on the road, and a smoking habit that became a constant companion. Roy smoked through drives across America, through recording sessions that lasted until sunrise, through grief that never left him alone. Even after heart surgery in 1978, he kept going, pushing himself the way only someone who sings from pain can. And then, just as life began giving something back, new albums, a resurgence of love from fans, a place in the traveling Wilburys alongside George Harrison and Bob Dylan, his heart gave out. On his final day, he rode motorcycles, laughed with his children, and felt hope. Hours later, he was gone. The world fell silent. Musicians from Bruce Springsteen to Bono spoke of his voice as something sacred, something eternal. Roy Orbison's life was a song about beauty and heartbreak, one that reminds us how fragile even the most powerful voices can be. If his music still echoes in your heart, tell us which song still lives inside you. Number 11. Lemmy Kilmister. On December 28, 2015, the thunder of Motorhead fell silent. Lemmy Kilmister, the founder, bassist, and unmistakable gravel-voiced heartbeat of the band, passed away in Los Angeles just 4 days after turning 70. To fans, he was not just a musician. He was a lifestyle, a symbol of rebellion, grit, leather, fire, and the unstoppable roar of rock and roll. But behind the speed, the grit, and the sharp humor, there was a body weathered by decades of cigarettes that burned slow but steady. Lemmy started smoking as a teenager in England, long before the world knew his name. When Motorhead exploded onto the scene in the late 1970s, Lemmy's voice cut through amplifiers like steel on stone. People always wondered how a human voice could sound so raw, so dangerous, so unforgettable. But Lemmy himself used to laugh and say his voice came from whiskey for blood. Through the 80s and 90s, he lived loud, fast, and completely unapologetic. Everywhere he went, tour buses, backstage rooms, recording studios, there was always smoke rising around him. Crew members and friends said there were moments you could track him in a room just by following the cigarette haze. Even as age crept in and illness tightened its grip, Lemmy refused to change who he was. When doctors warned him, he shrugged. When his body began to break, he kept touring. He collapsed on stage in Germany in 2015, and just days later, he was back, roaring into the microphone because the stage was his heartbeat. But that final year, his body could no longer match the fire of his spirit. After receiving his diagnosis, he went home, sat in his chair with his favorite drink beside him, playing video games and listening to rock records until the very end. When the world heard of his passing, stadiums went silent, guitars stopped, voices cracked. Fans didn't just mourn, they felt like a piece of rock's spine had been removed. Lemmy Kilmister's spirit still shakes the walls of every venue where rock is played. His legacy stands as both a warning and a triumph. Live real, live loud, but every flame burns something. Number 12. George Michael. On December 25, 2016, Christmas morning arrived with heartbreaking news. George Michael, the voice that carried warmth, desire, sorrow, and hope all at once, had passed away quietly at his home in Oxfordshire at just 53 years old. His voice had been the soundtrack of millions of lives, yet behind that velvet sound was a man quietly fighting battles no one saw. During the height of his fame with Wham, and later as a solo legend, George turned to cigarettes as a silent companion, something to ease the pressure of being adored and judged by the world at the same time. Smoking followed him into studios, limos, hotel balconies, and lonely nights where applause could not reach. Though his voice remained rich and powerful, those close to him noticed the gradual roughening of the edges, the soft cough behind the laughter. Interviews from the 2000s often showed him holding a cigarette even as he talked about trying to build a healthier life. Fame had cost him dearly. Losses, heartbreak, and exhaustion led him farther into the comfort of smoke-filled silence. In 2011, pneumonia struck and nearly took his life. He fought back, performed again, smiled again, but the body remembers what the heart tries to forget. And on that final December night, after a day filled with simple peace, his heart finally grew too tired to keep fighting. When the world learned of his passing, it felt like a light had gone out. Musicians, fans, and strangers cried, not just because a legend was gone, but because his voice had carried something so deeply human, vulnerability. George Michael's story is not just about music. It is about feeling, longing, and the quiet price of carrying on. In the winter of 2016, his health began to fade once again, quietly and without the public spectacle that had followed him his whole life. George Michael spent his final weeks in the peace he had always craved. At home, curtains drawn, no cameras flashing, no stages demanding his voice. On Christmas morning, as the world celebrated, he slipped away in his sleep, leaving behind a silence far heavier than any applause could fill. The news shattered millions. Fans, artists, strangers, people who had grown up falling in love to his songs felt a piece of themselves break. His voice had once lit radios, dance floors, bedrooms, and lonely midnight drives. Now it was a memory. Tributes poured in from every corner of the world praising not only his unmatched sound, but also his kindness. Quiet donations to hospitals, surprise gifts to struggling fans, private acts of generosity no one knew until after he was gone. George Michael's passing reminded the world that even the brightest stars burn silently, carrying battles unseen. Number 13, Randy Meisner. On July 26, 2023, the world said goodbye to the gentle, soaring voice behind one of the most emotional songs in rock history, Take It to the Limit. He passed away in Los Angeles at 77 after complications from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a condition tied to decades of smoking. Randy had always been the quiet one, the soft soul among storms. Born in the heart of the American Midwest, he grew up dreaming of open skies and wide horizons. When the Eagles were formed, his falsetto didn't just complete their sound, it lifted it. His voice could make an arena feel like one person's heart, but behind that lightness was a man who carried a habit that never loosened its grip. Cigarettes followed him from motel rooms to tour buses, from studio sessions to lonely late nights after the cheering faded. Even after he left the Eagles in 1977 searching for peace away from fame, the smoke stayed. As the years passed, his lungs weakened and performances grew rare. In his later interviews, Randy spoke softly about gratitude, about the miracle of having lived a life that touched so many. Musicians called him one of the purest voices to ever grace rock. When news of his passing spread, fans didn't just remember his voice, they felt it, and they still do, every time that final note in Take It to the Limit reaches for something just beyond human. Number 14, Shane MacGowan. On November 30th, 2023, the wild poet of the Pogues took his final rest in Dublin. He was 65. Shane MacGowan was more than a singer. He was a storyteller carved out of smoke, whiskey, joy, and heartbreak. He sang like someone who had lived 10 lives, laughing at pain even as it claimed him. Cigarettes were woven into his existence from the time he was a teenager wandering Irish pubs and London clubs, long before the Pogues put punk fire into folk tradition. On stage, he often held a cigarette like a quill, writing poetry into the air with every exhale. His voice, rough and ragged, carried the ache of history and the warmth of a crowded bar full of old friends. But behind the legend was a fragile body, worn thin by years of smoking that slowly stole his breath and strength. In his final years, surrounded by loved ones, he faced his decline with the same stubbornness and humor that made people adore him. When he passed, Ireland wept, not just for a musician, but for a voice that held the soul of a country. Shane MacGowan's songs remain alive in every pub chorus, every winter night, every heart that has ever loved too fiercely and lost. His voice may be gone, but his fire will never go out. Off stage, Shane smoked endlessly during rehearsals, late-night writing sessions, and quiet interviews in dimly lit rooms. He called it his anchor, his small familiar ritual when the world spun too fast and the music inside him needed somewhere to land. The years of touring, shouting lyrics into roaring crowds, and living on pure adrenaline carved themselves into his voice. What was once rough and rebellious grew deeper, heavier, strained with every breath. Friends watched him carefully, noticing how he sometimes paused to catch air, but Shane would shrug with a crooked grin and say he had already lived more life than most ever would. In the final decade of his life, infections came often, each one harder to recover from. The cigarettes that once calmed him now tightened around him like a cage, yet he kept creating because storytelling wasn't something he did, it was who he was. In those last years, he spent long days at home with his wife, surrounded by poetry books, warm laughter, and the familiar hum of old Irish songs in the background. Even when confined to a wheelchair, his wit stayed razor sharp, and his spirit burned like a candle that refused to go out. Days before his passing, he sang softly among friends for his 65th birthday, his voice thin but still filled with the truth that only he could deliver. When the news broke, grief swept across Ireland like a tide. Fairy Tale of New York played in pubs, on radios, in cars, becoming less a song and more a memory of everything he had been. Shane MacGowan's life was a wild symphony. Beautiful, reckless, fragile, unforgettable. His voice may be gone, but his words will echo every winter for generations. Number 15. Chris Cornell. On the night of May 18, 2017, one of rock's most powerful voices walked off a stage in Detroit after delivering a performance full of soaring notes and raw emotion. No one knew it would be the last time he would step into the lights. Hours later, he was found lifeless in his hotel room. He was only 52. The shock rippled across the world. Chris Cornell was a voice that felt carved from fire, able to rise into impossible heights and fall into low, aching whispers that spoke of pain most people never name. But behind the legendary sound was a man who had been fighting internal battles for decades. Battles made heavier by the long shadow of smoking that had followed him from his teenage years in Seattle. When grunge exploded in the 90s, Chris stood at the center of the storm. His performances were volcanic, breathtaking, but each scream, each note left its mark. Cigarettes became a quiet companion behind the stages and studio walls, something that steadied his nerves while the world demanded more. He tried to quit many times, but the pressure of creating, touring, and simply being Chris Cornell always dragged him back. By the time Soundgarden reunited, His voice carried years of triumph and weariness. It was darker, fuller, and painfully human. He called it survival, and fans called it legendary. In his later years, Chris poured his soul into his family and his music. He mentored young artists, spoke about healing, and insisted that vulnerability was strength. Yet, exhaustion follows even the strongest. After his final performance, applause still ringing in the air, the weight he carried finally grew too heavy. The next morning, the world learned what it had lost. Tributes came from every corner of music, from stadium legends to teenagers learning their first guitar chords, because Chris had given something no one else could, a voice that made people feel seen. His story is one of brilliance and heartbreak, of fire and shadow. And though he is gone, his voice still rises every time his songs play, unchained, eternal, unforgettable. If his music still lives in your heart, stay with us. There are more stories to tell, more legends to honor, more voices we refuse to let fade.